The rain had just stopped falling after 3 endless days. The sun finally peeked through the heavy clouds, lighting up the quiet village where James and Diep had been living since their wedding. The scent of wet soil mixed with the sweetness of fresh corn drifted through the open window, and somewhere in the distance, a rooster crowed lazily. Life had slowed down here, far away from the constant noise of the city, and for a while, James thought peace had truly returned to his heart. Every morning, Diep would wake up early to sweep the yard, feed the chickens, and prepare breakfast for James and his mother, Mrs. Hyen. Her laughter filled the small house like warm sunshine, and James often stood quietly by the doorway, watching her move about, feeling a strange calmness settle inside him. After all the storms they had gone through, the betrayals, the debts, the nights filled with uncertainty, the simple life felt like a dream he didn't want to wake up from. But that morning, something was different. Diep moved slower than usual. She tried to hide the pale look on her face, yet her hands trembled slightly as she poured tea. James noticed. "Are you feeling all right?" he asked, reaching out to touch her forehead. "You look tired." Diep forced a small smile. "I'm fine, maybe just a little dizzy. It must be the weather." Mrs. Hyen, who was kneading dough at the table, looked up with knowing eyes. "Dizzy, you say? And you've been eating less these days." Diep, "When was the last time you went for a checkup?" Diep blinked, her cheeks turning pink. James frowned, confused, until the realization slowly crept into his mind. He stared at his wife, unable to speak. Mrs. Hyen chuckled softly. "Maybe it's time to visit the clinic, just to be sure." Later that afternoon, James drove her to a small clinic near the market. The rain had left puddles along the road, and every bump made Diep's hand tighten around his. She didn't say much, only looked out the window, her reflection merging with the cloudy sky. The doctor, a kind middle-aged woman, smiled after finishing the examination. "Congratulations," she said gently, turning the screen toward them. "You're going to be parents." For a moment, everything stopped. James froze, his breath catching in his chest. Diep's lips parted, her eyes filling with tears. She looked at him, the man who had once lost everything, and rebuilt his world piece by piece, and whispered, "James, are you hearing what I'm hearing?" He nodded, tears glistening in his eyes. Then he laughed, a pure, unguarded laugh that made the doctor smile. He pulled Diep into his arms, his voice trembling against her hair. "We're going to have a baby, our baby." Diep pressed her face against his chest, feeling his heartbeat racing beneath her palm. All the hardships, all the sleepless nights, they suddenly felt worth it. In that moment, the world outside didn't matter anymore. When they stepped out of the clinic, the sun was setting. The golden light fell across the wet road, shimmering like liquid hope. James reached for her hand and whispered, "Let's go home." Diep smiled through her tears. "Yes, let's go home." As they walked back toward the car, a soft wind passed through the trees, carrying the scent of new beginnings. Neither of them said another word. They didn't need to. Deep down, they both knew that life, once again, was about to change forever. The following weeks passed like a gentle dream. The house was filled with quiet laughter and the soft rhythm of daily life. Mrs. Hyen hummed old lullabies as she cooked. James would leave early for the company and return with fruits and warm smiles for Diep. She often sat on the porch with a cup of tea, one hand resting gently on her belly, feeling a fragile, beautiful life growing inside her. But behind James's smiles, there was a storm brewing. The company, the one he had fought so hard to rebuild after John's betrayal, was suddenly facing another crisis. A major supplier had pulled out, shipments were delayed, and investors began to lose confidence. Each night, after everyone was asleep, James sat alone in his study, staring at the spreadsheets glowing on his laptop, the numbers swimming before his tired eyes. He told himself not to worry Diep. She needed rest, peace, and happiness. He would handle everything, no matter how heavy it became. But Diep noticed the change. She saw how his eyes lost their light, how his hands trembled slightly when he thought no one was looking. Sometimes she would wake up at midnight and find him sitting by the window, his face half hidden in the shadows. One evening, as rain tapped softly on the roof, she approached him quietly and placed a blanket over his shoulders. "James," she said softly, "you haven't been sleeping well. Is everything okay?" He forced a smile. "It's just business. Don't worry. My love, you and our baby, that's all I care about." But his voice cracked on the last word. To Diep's heart ached. She wanted to believe him, yet she knew that the weight he carried was too heavy for one man alone. The next morning, while James was at work, To Diep sat in the kitchen with Mrs. Hyen. The older woman's face was calm, but her eyes were full of understanding. "He's trying to protect you," she said quietly. "Men like James carry their pain in silence, but sometimes love means sharing the burden, not hiding it." Those words stayed into Diep's heart. Days turned into weeks. James worked longer hours, skipped meals, and barely spoke. The stress was visible in every movement. To Diep could feel the distance, growing, not because he loved her less, but because he was fighting too hard to protect her. One rainy afternoon, she overheard him on the phone. His voice was low, tight with worry. "What do you mean the deal fell through? We can't lose that contract." "No, I'll find a way to cover it." Her heart sank. After he left the room, she sat in silence for a long time, listening to the rain. That night, while he was still at work, she made a quiet decision. To Diep took out a small wooden box from her drawer. Inside were the papers for a piece of land, left by her late father. It wasn't much, but enough to ease James's burden. She knew he would never agree, but love, she thought, wasn't about permission. It was about faith. The next morning, she went to the notary's office in town. Her hands shook as she signed the transfer papers. The money she received wasn't just money. It was her family's memory, her roots. But when she imagined James's face free of worry, she felt peace in her heart. That evening, when James returned home, he looked exhausted. To Diep greeted him with a smile, hiding the secret behind her calm eyes. She placed dinner on the table and said softly, "Welcome home." James sat down, rubbing his temples. "I don't know what I'd do without you," he murmured. To Diep reached across the table, covering his hand with hers. "You'll never have to find out," she whispered. Outside, thunder rolled in the distance, a warning of storms to come. Yet in that moment, under the dim light of their little home, To Diep smiled, believing that love could still keep them safe. The rain didn't stop for 3 straight days. It drummed on the rooftop, whispering uneasily through the night as if warning of something neither of them could see coming. James sat in his office, exhausted but restless. He had just received an unexpected message from the bank. A large deposit had been made in the company's account, enough to save the project he had been struggling to keep alive. Relief rushed through him, but it was followed by confusion. Who sent it? The name on the transfer made his heart drop. To Diep. He froze. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. He grabbed his phone and called her immediately, his voice shaking slightly. "Diep, what did you do?" On the other end, her tone was calm but hesitant. "I just wanted to help you, James. I sold the land my father left me. It wasn't much, but it's enough to keep the company going, right?" He stood in silence, his throat tightening. "You sold your father's land," he whispered. "Without telling me, James," she said gently. "I know you didn't want me to worry, but I saw how hard you were fighting. I couldn't just stand by." "Stand by," his voice rose, harsh and trembling. "Do you think I wanted your sacrifice? That I can't protect my own family without you selling the last piece of your past?" Her voice broke. "I didn't do it because I doubt you. I did it because I believe in you. Because I'm afraid of what will happen to us if you keep carrying everything alone." There was a long silence. The sound of the rain between them felt like miles of distance. James finally spoke, his tone low and pained. "You should have trusted me enough to tell me. Love isn't about saving each other in secret. Diep, it's about standing together." To Diep swallowed her tears. "And what if standing together Means watching you fall?" Neither of them said another word after that. The line went silent, and something fragile between them broke. That night, Diep packed a small bag and returned to her mother's home in the countryside. She told Mrs. Hyen she needed some time to rest for the baby. Mrs. Hyen didn't ask questions. She simply hugged her and said softly, "Sometimes, distance helps hearts understand what words cannot." Days passed. James buried himself in work, though every report he signed felt heavier than before. The company began to recover, thanks to the money Diep had given, but his heart remained hollow. He missed her voice, her gentle hands, the quiet laughter that once filled their evenings. Yet pride chained him. The same pride that once helped him survive now built a wall between them. Then one afternoon, an email arrived in his inbox. The subject line read, "Investment proposal, Min Corporation." His stomach tightened. Min. The same man who had once competed with him in business and who had once looked at Diep with a kind of affection James had never forgotten. Attached was a note. "I've heard about your company's struggles. I'm willing to invest. Consider this a chance for renewal, no conditions, no strings attached." But James knew better. No one gave something for nothing. He stared at the message for a long time, his chest burning with unease. That night, he couldn't sleep. Images of Min talking to Diep, smiling at her with that calm, confident charm, haunted his mind. When he called her, she didn't answer. Panic surged through him. He called again and again, but the line stayed silent. The rain began to fall once more, heavy and cold against the window. Without thinking, James grabbed his coat and rushed out into the storm. His car headlights cut through the sheets of rain as he drove toward her mother's village. His heart pounded harder with every turn of the wheel. By the time he arrived, night had fallen completely. The house lights glowed faintly through the mist. He stepped out of the car, drenched, his shoes sinking into the mud. And there, under the dim porch light, sat Diep. She was humming softly, one hand resting on her belly, her eyes closed as if listening to the heartbeat within her. James stopped, unable to move. His throat tightened, his anger melting away, replaced by something far more painful, regret. He stepped closer, his voice trembling. "Diep." She opened her eyes slowly. For a moment, neither spoke. Then she smiled faintly, tired but kind. "You came." He knelt before her, his hands shaking as he reached for hers. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I let my pride hurt you. I should have seen that everything you did was out of love." Tears welled up in her eyes, but she shook her head. "We both made mistakes, James. You tried to protect me, and I tried to protect you. Maybe love isn't about who sacrifices more, but about learning when to stop fighting alone." The wind blew softly, carrying the scent of wet earth. James placed a trembling hand on her belly. "Can you forgive me?" Diep smiled through her tears. "Only if you promise one thing, that no matter how hard it gets, we'll face it together." James nodded, his voice breaking. "Together, always." Somewhere in the darkness, thunder rumbled, but for the first time. It didn't sound like fear. It sounded like a promise.